During the first few years of the PlayStation's lifespan, we would see many intriguing yet experimental titles, many of which would help to change the landscape of the future of gaming, as many of them also provided futuristic themes, but would try to mix in a variety of different gameplay elements that would just present many unique aspects that stood out to create series that would go on to be quite popular within the console's lifespan itself. And in 1996, Jet Moto, or otherwise Jet Rider as known in Europe, a game that was also released and developed by Single Track, the creators of Twisted Metal, and Warhawk, would make its way to the PlayStation and on the Windows PC later in 1997, and would prove to be the first in a popular series of games, with 3 in total being released on the system. There was a 4th entry that was in development but was later cancelled, at least midway during its development phase. I have actually covered a preview of that prototype game previously on the channel, so I'll drop a link to it down in the description so that you can also go and check it out. So this game is a futuristic themed racer that mixes future vibes with hovercraft racing and even water sports, so it has a lot of different dynamics at play. So essentially your goal is to race against a variety of different opponents across very intricate tracks that range from surface to decimated landscapes and even sea and water type of lakes, diving across mud tracks while avoiding obstacles and anything that can get in your way. You also do have unique aspects with regard to some of the control features, as there are a lot of sharp turns that you will face, and there's different types of elements that allow you to attach yourself to them so that you can whip yourself around those tight corners a lot easier. Now in some ways it works, in some ways it doesn't. It can actually hinder your progress as much as it can help you, so it just depends on the timing and how long you hold on to the button press, which in most cases, especially in the earlier games, it was usually the circle button, but that would change with later iterations or future sequels, as they would change up the control system completely. But the first 2 games in the series are considered to be the best in the entirety of the series, as they had the best track layouts and they just were a lot more fun to play. The first game, however, would slightly differ compared to its sequels, as you wouldn't gain access to the majority of the tracks available in the game. You would have to play on harder difficult modes, like from normal to hard difficulty, and you would have to win the races on those modes in order to unlock the rest of the tracks that were currently available in the game. While it has so many unique features, the game received mainly decent reviews, but the game was heavily criticised for its high difficulty and entry point, as even on the easiest difficulty the game is tough to master. It is very hard to win races, make no mistake about that, but it does have some many cool elements. Like, it has a multiplayer mode where you can play head to head against your mates, so if you have 2 controllers you can definitely have a lot of fun with this. There are a lot of quirky elements in it. It has a really quirky soundtrack as well, which also suits the aesthetic and the vibe that the game is going for. The game in many ways was often compared to Wave Race 64 that was released on the Nintendo 64, and in many ways that game is considered to be one of the best water sports games ever, and unfortunately every game that came out either before it or after it was always compared to that game. And the problem is that if it didn't match up, chances are in most cases most magazines and critics would always just give the games a low score, saying that it never was close to those games. But unfortunately, like, we have to remember, in many of these cases these games were being developed at a time when they weren't in comparison to other games. They were being developed with their own intricate and original ideas in many ways. They were never meant to be compared to Wave Race 64, as when you look at it they are very different games. But I think a lot of it is really down to the gameplay mechanics, which Wave Race 64, very like Mario 64 in terms of platformers, the control elements were always among the best seen on those systems. So I suppose when you look at it from that context, a lot of the games that were being developed, especially on the PlayStation, always kind of felt a bit lackluster with the controls and certain features, so that's what they would have always looked upon. But it doesn't take away from the game itself. It is different, let's just put it that way, but it does have enough fun elements that will keep you playing for some time, and it's a good laugh to play with your mates. I remember even going back to my first experience with this game. It was a couple of months before we had actually owned our own PlayStation. We used to rent the PlayStation out every weekend from our local video game store, and we would always get these 2 games with it. More often than not, one of the games was always Resident Evil, because we were obsessed with it and we just played that game to death. But we would always gain access to another game, so we'd always kind of pick and choose every week to try a different type of game and something that we would never have played of before. So it was interesting. We did get to play Jet Rider, which is over here in Europe, and we definitely enjoyed it, myself and my brothers and my mates, because it was different to a lot of other games out there, because we were also fans of Wipeout and a couple of other games like it. So when we got to play this here, it was definitely an interesting idea, and plus it was good fun to play the 2-player mode as well. Another thing that many people might not know about this game is that it was also released in and around the same time as Twisted Metal 2, which, as we all know, was probably the best car combat or vehicle popular combat game ever created, or the most popular one. So in many ways, Jet Moto, even though it's a very different game, wouldn't have appealed because Twisted Metal literally took over and was considered the more popular game, but they are very different in many ways. But still, it's an interesting title. It has some really quirky vibes and futuristic elements that really appeal to what it was going for. Yes, it did have later sequels. Jet Moto 2 pretty much carried on the same idea of the first game, but the third game was completely different. It completely changed up the whole dynamic. It had different visuals, it was built with a different engine, it had different graphics, even the control system was completely different, and in many ways the control system in the third game, which led to its poor sales, it wasn't as good. I played it and I didn't feel that it just didn't feel as good as the first two games. Although in saying that, I also played the second game, which I will cover in future videos, and the first game for me had the better tracks. The second game, like even with some of the prototypes and later sequels, some of the tracks, because they have so many broken up elements where you have to make jumps and there's loads of quirky and difficult features in them. While I suppose at the time they thought that they were a good idea, the games in general just felt very unfinished. It felt like the tracks were there but they just weren't fully pieced together, and it made it even more difficult to play, whereas you didn't really have that issue with the first game. The tracks were a lot more fleshed out and they were a lot more well put together. You felt like you had more control as to your progress throughout each of the environments, whereas with the future games they tried to do some really weird things and ideas, and yes, they may have been cool at the time, but when you look back at it, it's just like, no, it didn't make a lot of sense, and it actually made the game actually too difficult to play. So I can see why the series kind of fell by the wayside, because it's like as if the developers completely lost the concept of what they were trying to do. It's like they were trying to do something weird, and I don't even think sometimes it feels like they didn't even know what they wanted to do with the games, especially in the later sequels moving forward. So I think they really should have just stuck to the elements seen within the first two games, as they were the best in the series in all respects to them. But it's like anything else, it was an experimental time for games. Some ideas worked, some didn't, but when you find something that works, generally it's best to try and stick to it. I know people generally try to want to improve on it, but sometimes the improvements don't make sense and they actually make the games worse in many ways, which is a pity. But still, the game spawned 3 games in total on the series, and it did have a number of other games in the works that were being developed but were cancelled at different stages, and a lot of it contributes to the lack of sales with the final released entry, which would be Jet Moto 3, as it didn't sell well at all. So the series just went downhill from there. But still, it was an interesting time to see these games on the PlayStation, and you never know where it could have went had the series not just disappeared pretty much. But aside from those elements, I would love to know your thoughts of Jet Moto for the PlayStation, and what did you think of it overall? Did you enjoy these type of obscure racing games that were released on the PlayStation, or what were your favourite elements surrounding the gameplay features in this game? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other types of obscure futuristic style racers that were also released on the PlayStation, then you can check out the videos here on screen, and even some of the other videos I have covered previously on the channel to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.